I thought I'd just open today with a little story. A couple weeks ago, my daughter and I were having a little dance party in the living room, and it was a lot of fun. And yet, at one point, she slipped and fell on the hardwood floor, and she hit her face in such a way that really it seemed quite disturbing to me. And I rushed over to her, and she was hysterically crying. And the scene I saw in front of me was quite gruesome, and I saw her face just starting to swell up. And my first thought was, am I going to need to take her to the emergency room? And I took her up into my arms, and I just held and cradled her. And I would do anything in the world to keep her healthy and loved and happy. And I just started to walk around our living room. And there came a point where it was just like a lightning bolt hit me. And it was this thought that I didn't need to be afraid. And I could pray. I could pray in this very moment. I could go to God. And my sense of God is that God is love itself, the love which is not conscious of disease or limitation or dismay or doubt or fear, but the perfect love that the Bible talks about, casting out fear. And as I lifted my thought up to God, I got a little inspiration. And the inspiration seemed unusual to me at first. The inspiration was that my daughter was a timeless, perfect idea. Now, I thought, what does time have to do with this? But the truth was, I realized right away that I was kind of buying into this timeline. Like there was this image of injury, and then I saw an image of it making effects on the body, and it seemed to be getting worse. And I could imagine it getting worse and worse. And then eventually, with enough time, it would come and dip back down, and eventually she would get back to normal health. But I recognize in that moment that all human life is, in a sense, in these vacillations between good and bad. In fact, they think the material world is created out of waves. And I recognize that I could appeal to something that didn't have an up and down, a good and bad to it. But I think God is good itself, and evil or something bad is just the absence of good. It's not really something in and of itself. And I'm going to be talking about today how disease and limitation and beliefs of contagion, they're not really something in and of themselves, but they're really an absence of health and of the consciousness of wholeness and peace. It's an absence of the consciousness in which Jesus had. Well, in that moment, I lifted up my thought, and as I got that inspiration about my daughter being a timeless idea, I recognized that she was something fundamental, fundamental analogous to the numbers in the number system. You know, if you took a random number like 1,643, we don't talk about that very much, but if that disappeared out of reality, the stock market would come crashing down worse than any virus could cause. That number is absolutely vital. And I'm not talking about a mortal representation of that number. Like we could write that number on a chalkboard and then erase it, and it would make no difference to the stock market. But if the concept, the idea of that number disappeared, then we would really be in trouble. And I recognized that, like numbers don't evolve up to being what they are. You know, number 7 doesn't have to fight through a series of evolutionary steps or years of growth on a certain timeline to get up to number 7. And then it doesn't go through an old age process, a senescence process, where it droops down over time to become 6.9. Time is just another form of matter. And I recognize that my daughter was timeless in that she had an identity that is eternal, fundamental, like a number, right? That's absolutely vital, absolutely needed. And as I was letting that beautiful truth dawn on my thought and recognize that she was really an idea in the mind of God, in the mind of love itself, I felt such a serene, sublime peace. And I kind of went back to the human scene, so to speak, and looked down at my daughter. And I realized as I was cradling her in my arms, this little 3-year-old was peacefully asleep, or so it seemed. And so I walked upstairs and I was going to lay her down on the bed for a nap. And I realized she was awake because she started to talk to me. And she said, "Daddy, can you get me these stuffed animals?" And she wanted a few things for her nap. And I got them for her. And immediately she went down and fell asleep, which seemed like a miracle because like some of you probably know, 3-year-olds don't always want to go to bed right away. And anyhow, the first thing she said when she woke up a few hours later was, "Daddy, I'm healed. Mouth doesn't hurt anymore." And all the swelling had gone down. There was barely a sign of it. And we just never thought about it after that. And it wasn't a thing. And that got me thinking a bit, because not only did that moment just reinvigorate me to realize the power of prayer, and boy, I just see evidence of the power of prayer every day. In fact, somebody emailed me just today telling me, or actually we were talking on the phone about this, how they had a situation with real estate that seemed very difficult. And through prayer, and this last week, it all resolved in just a beautiful and unexpected and wonderful way. And I got another email, at least I discovered an email from a person talking about how some prayer some years ago that we did together, she was just expressing gratitude. I came across this email today about how she said all these problems with her in-laws all disappeared, that had been so chronic for so many years, but prayer really pierced through, and now she has a 100% loving relationship with all these people. So prayer is so powerful, and yet people talk about it in our public discourse in such namby-pamby ways. I woke up this morning and I was looking at the New York Times, and there was an article in the New York Times kind of arguing for the power of church, because some liquor stores are open right now as so-called essential services, whereas many churches are closed and under restrictions, and even ones that want to open up and use wise social distancing tactics. Some of them are not allowed to, and we need to think of church as vital. It's okay if we're not meeting in person. We want to abide by government regulations in every way, be really the most law-abiding, upright citizens we can be. But we want to think about church, about people who are dedicating their lives to genuine spirituality, as a very powerful and efficient way of helping. And just like that little healing with my daughter there, I think we can begin to see that there is something fundamental about life, eternal about life, that's true about each one of us, that can bring invigoration, renewed health, in a way that's not necessarily commensurate with the material senses. And I was thinking, it's interesting, when you read the Bible, Jesus goes through many periods of isolation. The very first chapter of Mark, which is by most scholarly accounts the first gospel written about Jesus, he is just healing people one after the next. And at the end of that chapter, he heals a leper who is was an apparently contagious skin disease. And the next thing we see happening is, because of his good work, the word started to spread about this Christ activity. That good news was spreading, and he was forced out into isolation. And it seemed like he accepted that, because in chapter 2, the first thing we see him doing is going out and healing someone of paralysis. And so many people feel kind of paralysis from analysis, from material analysis right now. They're reading the news reports ad nauseum, and they just feel a sense of, what can I do to help here? This seems like it's a train running outside of me, and I can't stop this big train. And yet the Bible teaches again and again about how humble prayer, childlike prayer, can beat the Goliaths in our life, or move mountains, in Jesus' words. move the biggest troubles that seem that we seem to face in life. And there's an account that's very famous in the Bible where Jesus goes out into the wilderness for 40 days. And the word quarantine, actually in its Italian and Latin roots, means 40 days. And when Jesus was out in the wilderness for 40 days, isolated, he used it as a time of prayer. And he was tempted again and again by the devil, they say, the Bible says. And the devil, I don't think, is an actual real entity out there. If the devil had any power or substance of its own, it would have just pushed Jesus off a cliff instead of asking him to jump himself. I think that the devil in the Bible represents any thought that goes against what is naturally harmonious and good and God-derived. Any claim or belief that is ungodlike. And Jesus famously faces up against 3 temptations in the wilderness. First, the devil tries to get him to make bread, to manifest bread. And for me, that speaks of that belief that we need to create our own supply, our own, what feeds us. And yet Jesus rejected that claim and knew that God brought supply to him. And so many people struggling with work right now, they need a sense of that they're supplied for, cared for. Jesus, walking out in nature, pointed to the lilies and recognized how beautiful these flowers just grow naturally, and said that they were adorned better than the most beloved king of Israel, King Solomon. And he really had a sense that telling people, well, just imagine how much God loves you, so much more than just a mere little flower. But there's an intelligence and love that is caring and supplying for each one of us. We're going to explore how we can really get in tune with that. Jesus was also tempted to jump from a high temple. And I think this is a sense of really using wisdom. He said we shouldn't test our God, quoting scripture. And a lot of people right now, we want to make sure nobody's risking life without just cause. Now, Jesus did come to show that life is eternal, deathless, but he was so wise about how to present that. And he, through prayer, listened to God and was impelled by God to do what's right. He didn't use any mental trickery to show how some kind of so-called spiritual thinking can manipulate matter. He didn't do any of that. It wasn't any kind of form of human will or manipulation. He taught the true principle of being and talked about how when we get in tune with love itself, with spirit, with God, and understand our oneness with God, then we can experience heaven right here. He never said we get heaven with death. He talked about heaven being right here within us. And that brings us to the last temptation that Jesus had in the wilderness, and it was to become a great king of the world. And I think that claim is about that all solutions need to be political, need to be about manipulating our outward material condition. But Jesus rejected that, and he taught that the kingdom of heaven is within us. And instead of becoming a political leader and simply changing our external or physical scenario, he taught about how to change our mental outlook and how to gain a truly spiritual, God-first perception of life, and how a spiritual perception of life can really transform everything, can bring us in concord with a whole person health that no material pill or manipulation of our outward circumstances can give us. I was watching an interview with one of my favorite actors recently, and he talked about when he first made $1 million. He said at that point in his life, he felt like he had achieved everything outwardly he could possibly imagine. And yet he felt a huge hole in his heart. He felt empty. And often people think that that what they want, that what they desire is in getting material stuff or the material scenario changing in a way that's favorable. But as we'll explore in this lecture, a genuine spirituality begins with renovating consciousness, bringing thought in line with God. And as we do that, we start to discover a kind of richness of joy and peace and sublimity that can't be discovered through any material manipulation or change. Now, the way that Jesus taught for us to become aligned with God and experience the kingdom of heaven right here and now, experience harmony, was through this process he called prayer. And there's this beautiful, ubiquitous image of prayer that people have all around the world that I really feel does strike at the heart of what this activity represents. Now, if someone drew someone praying, you could ask a child to draw this image anywhere in the world, they would probably draw someone down on their knees, eyes closed, hands folded. Now, of course, there are different variations of this symbol, but it really is ubiquitous. And for me, this symbol does connote what we're talking about when we talk about prayer generically. Now, to be down on our knees, for me, that represents humility. And what did Jesus say? I'm a great carpenter. I can do a lot of good stuff, but when it gets really tough, I go to God? No. He said, I could have my own self do nothing. He really had a sense that as an individual, isolated by himself, separate from God, he could do nothing for lasting gain. But as an expression of God, that all things were possible. And he really taught people how to be humble, meek, looking for peace and harmony for all, not for self-gain, and how to recognize that life is created not by a personality or self, but by the divine one ego, by God, by our one collective source, our Father, Mother, God, you could say, by love itself, another name for God. Now, Jesus also taught that we should go to pray in a closet. And for me, that metaphor of one closing one's eyes is another kind of analogy at blocking out our material or physical sense perception. Because a mere physical or material sense perception of life will never inform us of what is absolutely true. And our material senses can only just begin to scratch the surface of what's there. And Jesus, when he talked about going into a closet, he was a man of the wilderness. He was out traveling a lot of the time. So he wasn't obviously talking about a physical location. And there's no physical place that I think is any more spiritual than another. I don't think we need to have a Mecca to go to any special place. It's fine just being isolated right where we are and going into our closets mentally, because wherever we go, we can't evade consciousness. I remember reading a book in high school. It was kind of just beginning my nascent spiritual discovery. And I was reading a book about a man who wanted to kind of escape his troubles in life. And he went on a trip out to Africa, and he realized right away, unfortunately, he brought the same consciousness with him. The material environment didn't change him fundamentally. He was with the same kinds of thoughts, and he had to deal with those thoughts, right? And the Bible talks about bringing every thought into captivity to the Christ. And so we're going to see how that's possible. Lastly, with that symbol of prayer, there's that coming together, uniting. And so often in human life, there seems to be claims of division, of divisiveness, of dualism. And yet Jesus didn't say, God and I are separate, but when I pray, we're relatively close. No, he said, I and my Father are one thing. And this is so important for efficient and efficacious prayer, to realize that God, as the cause of life, needs an effect, and we are it. and you can't separate a cause from effect, or an effect from a cause, just like you can't separate the sun from the sun rays, or a ray of light coming out from the sun from its one source, the sun. You can't talk about one without the other. They can't exist without each other. And so this too is so essential in prayer, that we don't really have a life separate from the life that creates and sustains us. Now, when I was in college, I read a lot of wonderful books about prayer, and I continue to just kind of devour books about the mind-body experience, about how our thoughts matter, how consciousness is real. And there's one book that I read in college that completely transformed my life. It's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by a remarkable lady named Mary Baker Eddy. When I read this book, my whole life began to radically change. I was reading things like I had always known deep down inside, but I had never heard articulated so beautifully and thoroughly, numinously, just wonderfully. And as I was reading this book, glorious things started to occur in my life. I had a shoulder injury for many years since a kid. I had to stop playing sports when I was 13 because of this injury, and it always kind of was in the background. Just the shoulder was never perfect. And as I was reading this book, all the pains on that shoulder just went completely away, never to return. I was working for a woman who was chronically ill at the time to help put myself through college, and I started to share what I was learning, reading in that book. And within a few months, she was up out of her bed, taking dance classes, taking art classes. All sorts of wonderful healing started to come into my life as I read this book. And it was wonderful. It was as if the author of the book really knew the author of life, God, and was speaking with, therefore, authority. And she talked about a kind of spirituality that wasn't just a layer on top of our general material perception of existence, but was a wholly spiritual view of existence in and of spirit that really was an absolute spiritual perspective that really showed how a material or physical vantage point is an illusion. And we experience illusions all the time in life. And you could say that some illusions are so persistent. You could take just about anyone on the world and you ask them to walk out their front door and take a walk, and it would seem like overall they live on a flat earth. From any earthly point, you can basically walk out to the ocean or the sand dunes or something, and the forest, and surmise that the world is essentially flat. And yet that earthly perspective, even though it's shared all the way around the world, even though people believed it for a great deal of human history, that earthly vantage point of the earth being flat is an illusion. And to get outside that illusion, we need a higher perspective. If we are lifted up in a spaceship into outer space, and we got a truly higher, or you could say heavenly perspective, you could look down and see that the earth is a spheroid, and it's always beautiful from that higher angle. And I recognize there that you're not changing a flat earth to a sphere by getting this higher and more accurate view of it. You're just getting the correct perspective. And I think Jesus, when he saw people who were incomplete or sinning or diseased or even dead in some kind of evil or negative state, when he prayed for them and they experienced health and renewal and joy and upliftment and glory, I don't think he was changing anything at all. I think he was actually beginning to see life as it is from a higher, more heavenly perspective. He was seeing that we're all whole, complete, eternal ideas in the mind of God, and that true consciousness, when you feel really happy, a moment of just serenity, maybe just everything feels right. there's a synchronicity, there's a really sense of profound joy, then we don't have that sense of fear at the same time. They can't exist next to each other. And often when one experiences real love, they realize that any belief of hate that they had, or even discord, um, it, it really had no validity behind it. It was kind of a earthly perspective, our little kind of myopic from self perspective. Well, Jesus, of course, healed hereditary and chronic disease, and of all different forms. And a lot of people have thought over the years that maybe that was something designed just for him or the disciples. It was kind of a gift of healing. But I don't think real healing is changing anything at all. It's really just seeing life from a higher heavenly perspective, where we really cognize that wholeness, health, completeness are just written into our being. That's who we are. And Christian Science, which is, this is parenthetically the textbook of Christian Science, is basically saying that there is a science or universal knowledge of that Christ understanding which Jesus had. Now, if Jesus came back right now, that would be amazing. I saw a show on Netflix recently about a Messiah coming to earth in modern times and what that would be like. And one of the things that it would be like is still, it would be limiting, because no matter how great an individual is, even if they're Jesus, the perfect man, the perfect individual, we can't be with a human form all the time. You know, if you were able to talk to Jesus, maybe you would have the best moments of your life. Maybe questions would be answered that you didn't even know to ask. But then you would go home and you would think, oh man, I wish I could get back in his presence and ask him another question. And you would feel kind of absent from Christ. But the Bible gives us this promise that we can have the same mind that was also in Christ Jesus. And I think that's even a more powerful and useful and elevated appearing of the Christ, that divine communication of God. And so when Mary Baker Eddy, the author of this book, discovered Christian Science, she felt like it was a fulfillment to what Jesus was saying in the book of John when he said, I'm not going to be with you forever, but don't worry, I'll send you a comforter, the Spirit of truth. He was talking about that Christ's nature, which he embodied, that something would eventually come that would allow people to understand his teachings more cogently. And this understanding of Christian Science that's articulated in this book really does help people do that very thing. And the first line of this book says, the prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of him, and unselfed love. And I see this first line really as a keynote or linchpin for the entire work. And as you read through this book, which I hope you all do, it kind of unpacks what that line really means. But I'm going to give you a really condensed, really pithy version of this with a few just helpful analogies and healings to help illuminate that line. Let's begin with this concept of absolute faith. You know, people talk about faith in public discourse in a way that it's like something outside of reason. You know, it's a leap of faith. And yet the Bible defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Well, how can you have evidence for something if you can't see it to the material eye? Well, it's about science, right? Science is about knowledge that's often not in concord with what we're seeing on the surface of things. We need to dive deeper to gain repeatable scientific knowledge. And a lot of people think today that all knowledge is material or physical, you could say physical law. And that's a very depressing belief, because if you ask any physicist what physical law is, they would describe that all physical law is either preordained. It's like if you roll back the clock and you play out the physical laws, you'll get to the same place. Or the only other possible thing that could pop in there is maybe some chance occurrences through some quantum mechanics or quantum physics operation. Uh, and so all there is kind of the um, the laws that just play out or chance. There's no room for spiritual activity or genuine conscious understanding or volition. And I think that's a very depressing thought. And in fact, it's untrue. It's untrue because I think that everything begins with consciousness. You've never had an experience, a thought, an encounter that hasn't been a conscious one. I don't think anyone ever will be. But a lot of people are sunk into this belief that the body is housing mind, that consciousness is in mind. And there are valid reasons for that. You manipulate the brain, and that affects your conscious experience. But there are different mental processes which also affect each other, like emotions and thoughts. You have an emotion, it will affect the way you're thinking in very tangible and measurable ways. And the same thing with a certain thought will produce a kind of emotion, which are both mental phenomena. But if we back up a little bit and see and ask, well, how can a world be governed as a whole? And we see it when you just leave consciousness alone. At night, when you dream, there's a whole world that's being governed by one mind, in that case, a mortal mind. And inside that dream, we carry with ourselves in mentality a concept of body, which is a concept of identity showed forth in body. So you're in a dream, you'll be looking around, often you'll be walking, you'll be seeing things, you'll be touching things perhaps, and yet all those faculties you recognize when you wake up from that dream were wholly mental. And if you had a problem in the dream that you thought was physical, it was really caused by a mental belief, a mortal mental belief. And some years ago, I was really woke up to this when I was traveling over on the Nepali-Indian border. I was deeply enamored with mountain climbing. And I went to do a climb out there, and there was a man who I met who just seemed so downtrodden and negative. And he had a wonderful family. I stayed at their guest house. And anyhow, after a few days hiking, I went back to the town of Darjeeling, famous for the tea out there in India. And I had a few days in town, and I heard from my mountaineering guide that that man who I had visited up in the guest house up in the foothills, that he had a bad fall and was in the hospital and was critically ill. People thought he was going to die. And he asked me if I wanted to go visit him because, I had spent some time with him up there. And of course, I wanted to do that. And I went into this hospital, and I have to say it was really the most disturbing mental environment I'd ever walked into. It just seemed like such an unsanitary place. And there was just such a tangible sense of sickness and of evil. And when I walked into the room of this man, he apparently was possessed by a demon. This culture believed that believed in demonic possession, and this particular man, they believed that he fell on a tree as he was cutting down some wood, and he was when they found him, he was possessed by this demon. And they were so worried because in their culture, they said when this happens, people usually don't come back to their normal lives. They usually just stay in this maddening state until they pass on. And in fact, he was strapped down to this bed, and it was just a very ugly scene. He was thrashing about, and it did seem like he was possessed. Now, the thing is I don't believe in demonic possession. This is not something normal in the culture that I live in. And from the United States perspective, of where I grew up, the only time that I'd ever seen demons was on Halloween. And I really had a sense that I could unmask this false belief, because everyone was buying into this story. It was so contagious. Everyone said, oh yeah, this happens, and we've seen it before, and what happens is they get worse and worse, and they pass on, and all these people were crying, family members and so forth. And I felt like I was kind of standing on the outside, like, we don't need to buy into this. This is just a belief, a false belief. And I thought about Jesus, because Jesus, I think, is someone who is standing outside from such a higher perspective. He saw that the limiting beliefs, cultural beliefs, beliefs in sickness and sin and disease and death, that these were all ungodlike beliefs, and that one can begin to gain the perception of God, that where there is no darkness at all, there is no negativity. And in that light of pure consciousness, disease can evaporate just like darkness with the dawning of the sun. And so I went back to my hotel that night, and I just prayed until I could really tangibly get a sense of God's presence. And there was a line from the Mary Baker Eddy's writings that really stuck out to me. I remember thinking about that night. And the line was the following. It says, just pull this up for you. No evidence before the material senses can close my eyes to the scientific proof that God good is supreme. And I just knew that the evidence before my eyes, that wasn't the highest perspective here. And even though it seemed natural to them, a natural law, you could say, to them, it wasn't natural at all. And Jesus, right in the face of so-called natural disasters, whether a violent storm or someone dying of apparent natural causes, he appealed to the higher law of God, and he brought about healing. And the sense you get from reading the Bible and really imbibing Jesus' teachings is that nothing that's negative, evil, is natural. God is good itself. So harmony is established fact. And that, as it says in Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good to them that love God. Well, as I was praying that night, I felt that sense of peace that often is indicative of healing. And a few days later, I went on a hike back in that region where I had first met that man up in the foothills at his family's guest house. And when I was hiking through there, I wanted to visit the family. I thought they would be back there, and I was certainly ready to comfort them. And I had been praying about this man ever since that experience. And when I came back, it was just such a wonderful moment. The man was there. He was back at his home. And he was not only in a right state of mind, he was just in this incredibly joyous, grateful state of mind, a completely different demeanor than when I saw him last. And the beauty of Christian healing is that it transforms us inside and out. And it not only just eventually heals us outwardly, sometimes instantly, sometimes takes a little time, but it reforms us morally, and it uplifts our character, our vision of ourselves, and our ability to live with a life of integrity and honesty and joy. And so, I talked to that man, and apparently shortly after I visited, he started to come back to his normal consciousness, and he just felt like there was such a joy there. And joy is such a big part of Christian life. Jesus talks again and again and again about joy, as it's not something we should quickly dismiss, but joy is really the nature of who we are. And Mary Baker Eddy, in one of her passages in Science and Health, she has this line, if you boil it down, it basically says that man, talking generically about all individuals, is joy, that joy is really fundamental to our being. Now, as I noted earlier, Christian Science healing is not any form of manipulation. Often people, when they talk about faith, they talk about a kind of faith healing that's, getting a lot of good energy or praying to change the situation from bad to good. And Christian Science really is not about altering oneself or another person's life. It's really just about beginning to lift our consciousness to God, to see that wholeness and perfection. Mary Baker Eddy talks about perfection underlying reality. Without perfection, nothing is wholly real. And then, you just imagine the numbers. The numbers are all perfect. They have their perfect spot. If they fluctuated from day to day, there would just be pure chaos on Earth. But they have their perfect niche, perfect spot. And when we realize that our identities are perfect, are whole in God, then that can really change everything. And to begin to understand that, we have to begin with God. And Mary Baker Eddy in Science and Health says that God is incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love. And I don't think she was trying to shoehorn the infinite into these little terms to say, if you speak about God in this way, then you're a Christian Scientist, or then you're somehow saved, or anything like that. She was presenting the true concept of God from different angles that, when understood, helps relieve us from any of the limitations that we could get from reasoning out from a material or physical sense of life. And she saw that life is love, that love is principle. Principle comes from that same word as the word prime does. If you look at the etymology of those two words, they come from the same root. And prime means something that's irreducible, fundamental. It can't be explained in terms of anything else. And in every philosophy or paradigm of life, one needs to start with what's called a first principle or first principles. In other words, you can't explain one thing in terms of another forever. If you look at life as merely physical or material, that means that life is made of stuff. So, what's a human then? Human, if you're looking at life physically, you would say life, human is a body. They don't have a body, they are a body. And what's a physical body? It's made of organ systems. What are organ systems made up of? They're made of organs. If you keep going farther down, you get to molecules, cells, eventually atoms. And if you try to open up an atom and see what's inside there, when physicists first did that, they thought they were going to see the building block of life. And when they opened up the atom, they saw there was nothing there. It was 99.999, many nines, % empty space. In biblical vernacular, you could say, Adam, where art thou? And if you didn't catch that joke, the very first chapter of Genesis is this beautiful poem that gives you the right sense of life. It's really, I think, the linchpin of the Bible, this beautiful poem that gives you this sense of life made from one thing, spirit, God, and everything being good, and yet there being a forever progress, or you could say a development to life. And in that beautiful chapter, you see that word "and" more than 50 times, but there's never a but. There's never an exception to that goodness that God makes. And that but comes in chapter 2. In chapter 2, it says, but a mist comes up from the earth. And what does a mist do? It obscures things. You can't really see what's going on when there's a mist. And from this misty perspective, it then presents a sense of life or God as material, as made from the dust. And God is also presented as kind of capricious, a kind of human personality, just a clearly wrong conception of the divine. And from that sense of life being good and bad, it shows man being made of matter and spirit, of the flesh and of the mind. And this Adam man, that man is called, the first thing he does is fall asleep. saying that this conception of man can become asleep or blind to what's really going on. And in that dream that Adam has, the very first thing that he dreams is that woman was made for him. He must have been dreaming. Then, there's this whole kind of zero-sum game that plays out after that he starts to fight with his brother, believing if life isn't matter, then we need to fight for good. But the truth is, when we see life spiritually, we see that life is naturally abundant and infinite with good. And the thing about life being spiritual is that if it's in qualities, the qualities of God, then the more we express these qualities, the more that we see that we have them infinitely. Like if I share a loving thought with one person, another loving thought with a person, another loving thought, ad infinitum, as I go along, I will just realize that there's more and more love to be had, right? You would never just run out of love. Whereas if you see life in terms of matter, you have $5 in your back pocket. If you start giving it away, you're going to become poor. And I had a friend some years ago who really started to learn this as he started to perceive himself as spiritual and not material. And this was a buddy of mine that I kept meeting up in very synchronistic ways throughout our lives. And one time we were both looking for apartments in a small town. We didn't even know we were both living in that small town at the time. And after a long and arduous search, we both landed on apartments right next to each other, sharing a back balcony. And we were delighted, as you could imagine. And what happened next was quite glorious. We were both going through difficult breakups. And I remember in a rather uninspired moment, I said, you should go win her back. And I shared some human advice. And he said, you know what, Nate, I actually think I should read that book that you gave me, Science and Health. He said, I think the answers are in there. And as he started to read this book, his life started to brighten and beautify. And he started to realize that instead of trying to find love from one individual and just get love, that the more he gave it away to the people in his life, the more he started to feel a sense of completeness, that God is love and that all love comes from God. And the more we understand God, the more we find that the goodness of God is fitted just for us. Jesus, when he was appealing to his disciples, talking to them about prayer, he said, if you ask if you're a father and you ask, if you're a son and you ask your father for a piece of bread, your father would never give you a stone, right? And he lifted up the conversation. He said, no, just imagine what your heavenly Father will give to you when you ask God for what you need in prayer. In other words, that God knows our need and will meet it better than a human father, because God is our real divine Father, Mother, God. And Jesus really had a sense of when he prayed for something, that it would be resolved in a very specific way that was just tailor-made for us. There's a healing I often share in this lecture about how I once prayed when I was missing a sandal, and I just reached out my arms and they hit something there, and I put it in front of my face, and it was a sandal that was the exact size of my foot. And I was way out in the wilderness, away from any person or store, and there was nobody in sight. It was just marvelous. But there are many examples like that when one really realizes the mental nature of life, and that ultimately mind, God, is love itself. Then we can begin to see this love meeting our need in a way that's just for us. If you ran into somebody on the street and they said, I am love itself, but I'm not going to show you, that wouldn't be very loving. Love is meant to be revealed in a way that's concrete, tangible, experienceable. Well, back to my friend. He had some wonderful healings in Christian Science. And one time later in his life, he called me out of the blue and he said, Nate, can we pray about teeth? Is that something fair game? And I said, of course we can. We can pray about anything under the sun, as long as we're viewing something within our conscious lives, as we view it more out from God, or whatever that situation represents out from God. we're inevitably going to experience more harmony and a deeper feeling and experience of our oneness with God. Well, what he shared with me was the following. He said, I'd been going to the dentist for years and was told each time that I needed a root canal because my tooth was dead and discolored. The only other option was to have it pulled. And the dentist basically gave him an ultimatum and said, you got to deal with this now, or there's going to be more troubles in your mouth. And he had been evading it for some time, and he was in between jobs. He didn't have health insurance. Like a lot of people right now, he was struggling with money, and he felt like, is there a solution that's not going to cost me a lot of money? And he thought maybe prayer could do this. But he wasn't just using prayer because it's cheap. I think he really sensed the ancillary effects of prayer, that when you pray about something, it doesn't just affect that one area of your life you're praying about, because consciousness is unitary. In other words, I live on the coast, on a coastal river, and when the tides come up every day, they take every boat and everything in that river up with them. Not one boat stubbornly stays down below. And when we lift our thought to God in prayer, it's lifting our entire outlook, and everything in our life can begin to beautify and harmonize. Well, in this particular circumstance, we started to recognize that my friend's life, being an expression of life itself that's fundamental, was inherently deathless, that there couldn't be anything dead in him. Death is an absence of life. It's not something. And death, I think, really is an illusion. I've interviewed many people who have had near death or even what you could call after death experiences, where the body had stopped operating, the heart stopped beating. And yet their experience of life when they came back was that they moved forward with a sense of identity that was relatively similar to the one they had before they, quote unquote, died. Just like in a dream, we carry with ourselves a sense of identity. And often people in near-death experiences, you ask them what happened, they said, well, I was walking towards a light. Well, what were they walking in? They were looking at things, sometimes touching things, and sometimes they'll turn around and they'll see they'll see a body that was their body on earth, and they'll be called to go back to it. But we take a sense of identity wherever we are. We bring our sense of body wherever we are, because we're the embodiment of mental qualities. And we need to get outside of any mental belief or quality that's not expressive of God, because God is what we really are an expression of. And when we want to experience something that is right, often in life when we talk about things that are right, we just talk about them, well, something favorably has happened. But when it's really right, it's expressing the principle of life. It's expressing God. And it literally is right, just like when you write 2 + 2 = 4, it's right because it expresses a principle. You could see 2 + 2 = 4 and 2 + 2 = 5 right next to each other. Like you could see a diseased person and a healthy person right next to each other. But one is representing something that is fundamentally true. And one is you could see it materially, but it's not representing the principle of math or the principle of God in this case. Just like, or the 2 + 2 = 5 is a principle of math, or someone who is sick would be, they're not expressing the principle that is God. But health really is a mental condition. You can't just observe it from the outside. Health is a condition of mind. It's an understanding our absolute oneness with God and beginning to perceive life as Jesus saw it. Now, when I was praying with my friend about his tooth, we sensed that not only could there not be any death in him, but the substance of things hoped for, that absolute faith, that evidence of things not seen, it was there. His spiritual identity was there in that very moment, and that any belief of death was that. It was a belief. Even though there was an x-ray that showed a dead tooth, that image was not the image of God. The very first chapter of Genesis says, we are the image and likeness of God. That's the image that we held to that night. And that word substance is correlated with the word understanding. Substance, understanding. And Mary Baker Eddy in Science and Health says the right understanding of God restores harmony, or the right understanding of him, in fact, in that book, which is talking about God, restores harmony. And so as we prayed that night, we thought a little bit about an analogy, at least I did, about how God expresses each one of us like the sun expresses a light ray. And if you said something to a light ray like, hey man, you're not good, you got death in you, it would make no difference to the shining of the light ray. If you walked up to that light ray, tried to put it into a box it up, look inside that box, would it be in there? No, it can't be boxed in or materialized, you could say, put into a little material box. And you couldn't try to manipulate that light beam in any way that it would stop shining, right? And even if you stop seeing that light beam, maybe the earth tilted and turned and you didn't see that light beam from the sun anymore, it would still be shining, even though you're not seeing it and darkness is upon you. The reason for that is because everything in those light rays or sunbeams come from their one source, the sun. And without going into all the physics of it, the sun creates those light beams out of its very own being in a manner that's brand new and continuous every moment. And I love that because just like when you dip your hand into a river and you put the water down and you dip it again, it's all new water, even though it's the same river. Same thing with a light beam, all new light beam every moment. And it comes right from its source, not from its material surroundings or words. And in a way that is related in the book of Revelation, I think it reaches its grand zenith or hallelujah in chapter 21, when it talks about all conceptions of death falling away. And then it says, behold, I, God, make all things new. And that night we felt that perennial, forever newness of God. And to finish that story, this is what my friend wrote about that experience. He said, the day after we spoke and prayed about it, I went into the dentist and all the nurses were baffled. They looked at the x-ray from before, the ones taken that day. They looked into my mouth. They said that tooth looked perfectly healthy and I was fine. Nothing further was needed. They said they had never seen anything like it before in all their years of dentistry. Isn't that wonderful? Well, it's not a supernatural experience. It was supernatural. What we experienced that night in prayer was just the most wholesome, lovely, holy experience one can have. And those words, wholesome, holy, whole, are interestingly related in their etymology. These are all really speaking about the same thing. And to understand our wholeness is to get in touch with that holy state of mind, which Jesus, of course, had. And, you know, when I was a kid, I remember loving Jesus so much. I enjoyed going to some different Sunday schools. My mom was kind of church shopping when I was young. I liked reading the Bible, hearing about Jesus. And yet I just thought I could never do the things that he did. And yet in the Bible, he took everyday people, housewives, fishermen, and he said, you guys are going to do the same things that I did and even greater. Well, I want to tell you a story about a woman who kind of caught a glimpse of that. And it starts from a very humbling spot in life. This woman, Harriet O'Brien, she was alive during Mary Baker Eddy's age. And parenthetically, there's a lot of wonderful biographies about Mary Baker Eddy. This is one of my favorites, called Christian Healer, catalogs over 300 healing experiences that she had, all as a result of prayer alone. And she healed so many people of chronic and hereditary disease, cancer in its last stages, just amazing things you can read there. And when people met her, they didn't just get addicted to her personality. They really learned something about the universal science or knowledge of God. And that, in her words, the intercommunication is always from God to his idea, man, talking generically about man, representing both men, women, children. And this woman, Harriet O'Brien, she had so many troubles in life. She got diagnosed with chronic heart issues, chronic spine issues. She picked up what's called an iatrogenic ailment along the way, something caused by medical intervention. One of her ligaments was severed by accident, and she was relegated to a wheelchair. It was thought that she would probably never walk again. And when she was really at death's door, she really was being monitored by physicians around the clock, thinking she could pass on at any moment. It was then when she was introduced to Christian Science. And through Christian Science prayer, she quickly started to revive. Before she knew it, she was feeling great. And yet she was still in that wheelchair, praying with a practitioner week after week, month after month. She eventually was able to get out of that wheelchair, walk normally. She had been so ill, she said she had to relearn how to speak, relearn how to write. And she did. She became a very successful woman, eventually met Mary Baker Eddy personally, began to work for her personally. But the first time that she met her was a very pivotal moment for her. After she was healed, she had this deep desire to meet Mary Baker Eddy. I think she thought that she was kind of the source of her healing. You know, she wrote this book, she taught the people and the individual who prayed with her, who helped her through that healing. And when she met Mary Baker Eddy, this is what she briefly wrote about this brief encounter. Transparency is the word that best expresses my impression of Mrs. Eddy. Instinctively, I felt her great love, and I was conscious that no one I had ever seen loved me as much as she did. My entire thought was filled with a spiritual illumination, and there was a glory in the sunshine and landscape as though a breath of heaven had swept earth and enveloped me. Sounds like a good day, right? Well, if I was her, I probably would have said, I'm going to be knocking on Mary Baker Eddy's door tomorrow, getting another dose of that loveliness. But that was not the effect that she made on people. She really brought out the best in individuals and showed people their inherent worth, their own ability to get in tune with God. And when people came to her personally, trying to find salvation and thinking of her as the cause of health or goodness or love, she immediately pointed them back to God, that we all have a direct connection with God that nothing can take away. And she once wrote to a student that at all times, let your trust be in God, not me. Personal contagion comes of thinking of me as a person to bear your sins or be a personal medium of your salvation, for I am not. All that I do for you is by means of my pen and teachings. I can do nothing more. And that's not to say that she didn't pray with people individually and bless them ad infinitum, but she really recognized that pitfall of personality, often remarking that it's even more difficult to heal than sickness. And it's so important that we do. I was on a run recently, and it just dawned on me with such clarity that personality is just the opposite of spirituality. Either life is being informed by persons, or it's being informed by God, by spirit. And often we get kind of mesmerized by the news, thinking that power is in personality or an individual person. The Bible says God is not a respecter of persons, but just loves all of us equally and beautifully. And that brings me to that account in the book of John when Jesus was at the well, at a well, and he saw a Samaritan woman, and he started talking to her, which was quite extraordinary because women weren't really valued at that time, especially women who are Samaritans, especially this woman who had been apparently married many times. And yet Jesus was there just talking to her, sharing with her about the deep things of God. And he talked about, if you drink the water that I give, you won't thirst anymore. And he was talking metaphorically about what he was offering to her and to all of us, that there is a perspective that he taught out from that is the eternal perspective of life. After all these years, Jesus is by most accounts the most influential person who ever lived. And he said, heaven and earth shall pass away. Like everything will pass away, but my words will not pass away. He really understood what he was teaching about life being eternal. It was forever true, and it will stand the test of time. And this woman, Harriet O'Brien, after she was touched so dearly by Mary Baker Eddy that day, and really got a sense of what I think was fundamental about life, about God, not just a person, which comes and goes. And Harriet O'Brien said when she met Mary Baker Eddy, she had a question in her heart, and that question was, can I be a healer too? And she said the moment she met Mary Baker Eddy, that question was answered without words being exchanged. She went back home to her home in Kansas City and promptly started a Christian Science practice. And I don't think it was a leap of faith, but it was really an unselfed move. It was impelled by love, by divine love, that same love that healed her, that same love that Mary Baker Eddy was speaking out from. That quote that I read to you, it said that she thought that no one she had ever seen loved me as much as Mary Baker Eddy did. But yet Mary Baker Eddy didn't know anything physically about her or personally about her. And we don't need to know physicality or personality to know love, and to know the kind of love that heals and reforms. And essentially, when all things are added up, is that one ingredient that can bring us that whole person health, divine love. As it says in this book, Science and Health, divine love always has met and always will meet every human need. Well, with that, I'm just going to open it up to some questions here to see how this can be applied to some of the things you're thinking about, and then I'll wrap it up at the end. Now, let's see if any questions came in. Let me take a look. Okay. Someone said, how can we correct the errors and see in our politicians, other government leaders, and some business leaders who are obviously coming out of error? Well, one of the things I love to recognize is that Jesus lived in the midst of an incredibly difficult political situation. He was under Roman occupation. The Jews were under Roman occupation. Jerusalem under Roman occupation. And the Roman Empire seemed like this behemoth who was just bulldozing one great civilization after the next. They overcame the Babylonians, the Greeks. Now the Jews were under their control. And there was a great sense that the Messiah would be a great king, a Jewish king, like King David, who would destroy the Roman army, likely by physical and violent force. And yet Jesus, he really saw the pull to think that power is only in political or external means. It really takes us away from spiritual growth and in the end, the meaning of life, because the meaning of life is to understand spirit and how we can become, how we are the eternal expressions of God. And in order to do that, we can't think that our life is dependent on external sources. Jesus, right when things that seemed externally bad or politically bad, he went within himself. He prayed. He got in tune with God, and then he started to experience humbly the fruits of real perception. But he saw life in and of spirit or in and of mind. And I think that Mary Baker Eddy really had a shift. In the middle of her life, at age 44, she fell on the ice and was so injured that it was thought that she might pass on. And up to that point, she was very motivated by a lot of humanitarian political causes. In fact, I believe she was on the way back from a temperance meeting, which was kind of a political cause at the time of that fall. And yet, after that moment, she really saw, you know what, there's a higher way to help and heal humanity and to live out what we're most destined to do, to be God's expressions. And that's to understand mentally life and reality correctly through prayer and devotion to God. And then we'll be moved in ways that are very humble, person to person, experience to experience, making a difference. You know, when you hear somebody's eulogy at the end of their life, you don't really hear too much about who they voted for or what their political stances were on particular issues. You usually hear about these moments of love and connection that reveal their true character, that really blessed someone's life, that was often these little moments that were so meaningful. Well, Jesus really was in these little moments that resulted in healings, that resulted in the greatest experience of life. That's what ended up changing all of human history. So I think a part of it is just, getting outside of that feeling that the power is political. And I would also say it's very powerful to remember that Jesus said we need to love our enemies. And I think what he was really saying is we need to love everyone, because you can't love and hate someone at the same time. So you can't really continue to see them as an enemy. Mary Baker Eddy has a wonderful article called about loving your enemies in her book, Miscellaneous Writings, that some of you might want to take a look at. But that really helps us find peace in ourselves, an ability to love everyone. And even if it's very hard to recognize goodness in a particular politician, we can still be grateful for little aspects of what they do. And we can also stand for principle and not person. So we're not so connected with the person in power, but just work for the principles which are right. Someone said, during this pandemic, how do you pray for very fearful family members? Well, it is that perfect love that casts out fear. And we want to love people in a way that they feel very comfortable. We want to strive to be the most law-abiding citizens and do what comforts others. And that often takes just an open, tender, patient heart. But perfect love does cast out fear. So the more in our own prayers that we can get in tune with love. I often read the Christian Science Bible lesson every day. That's very helpful. Just reading the Bible in science and health, just imbibing the spirit of the written word there is very helpful. There's an acronym for fear: false evidence appearing real. And so just to really not buy into the story. And it's not often even saying that to people, it's in the knowing. Jesus didn't say you would say the truth and it'll make you free. He said you would know it. And so when we really know that disease doesn't have any power or influence or reality because it doesn't exist in God or from the higher heavenly perspective that we've been talking about, the more that we can feel a sense of freedom in sharing goodness with others. And that word corona, by the way, there's a beautiful meaning of it. It's a halo around the sun or planetary or another planet and or another sun, I believe. And if you see a corona, astronomical picture of it, it's gorgeous. And it's this symbol of a circle, which for me represents eternity. So we can hold that sense of eternity, wholeness in our thought. And that's the corona that we need to be cherishing. And disease has No, it can't influence an idea, just like that ray of light can't be influenced by what's said to it or by what physically happens to it or by trying to isolate it in a box, right? And so it does start from love, and it starts from this spiritual understanding that we've been talking about. But the very presence of someone who is at peace brings healing and solace and relief to individuals. So it's to first seek the kingdom of heaven in our own consciousness, spend more time praying for ourselves, and then we can help and heal others more effectively. Okay, maybe there's a couple more that came in. I'm just sifting through them. Let's see which one would be good to answer. One person just says, where is God in all of this? Does he or she have power to take away disease? One way to think about that word disease is dis-ease. And real health flows from that consciousness, which is totally at peace. One of the ways to think about being an expression of God, that prefix X means without, and pression means pressure. So to be an expression of God is to be without pressure or conflict within you. All conflict or pressure begins with a sense of duality, two things pushing up against each other, causing friction or undue conflict. And just a sense there really is this oneness to life. One thing expresses life. It's divine love, God. And everything in existence really is an idea of the divine mind or an expression of love. And as we see that heavenly vision of things, everything starts to begin to harmonize. All things work together for good to them that love God. And God knows nothing about disease, just like light knows nothing about darkness. If you said, hey, flashlight, come look at this dark place, come look under my house. It's been dark there for as long as I can remember. If you put a flashlight and point it under the house, if it's dark, the flashlight would say, I don't see the darkness. I only see what my light illumines. And I think Jesus, when he saw a situation, he didn't see the darkness, or he wasn't impressed by it or affected by it. If he saw it at all, he saw it, I think, as an illusion, as something insubstantial. But the light of God's love reveals health and peace and goodness and continuity, love. And so it is in cultivating that spiritual awareness, that reality, vision, that we can begin to see that not only is God not in disease or limitation, but in our apprehending life spiritually or out from God, that does result in upliftment and healing, the mitigation of fear and its inevitable destruction. Well, just to close up our time together here, I'd like to go back to that line one last time, the prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick. It's an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of him, and unselfed love. And often when we think about that line, as we did today, we thought about it in relationship to God. How do you have an absolute faith in God that's inclusive of understanding and love? But as we do that with God, we can't help but turn to our neighbors and begin to have an absolute faith in them. And how do we do that? How do we have an absolute faith in somebody, no matter how many times they mess up? Well, just think about Jesus. His disciples, they were kind of stumbling along. And even though Jesus gave everything to these folks, gave all of his heart, his mind, his soul to helping them improve as healers, as Christians, they denied him in his darkest hour, right? And when push came to shove, they said, I don't know this guy at all. And who did Jesus resurrect to? These same nincompoops who are denying him, right? And I just think, how did he have that absolute faith in them and even interest in them? Well, because I think he really understood them as needed, beautiful ideas. And you don't have a principle of math without every number being needed and having its perfect place. And I don't think you have life without every individual expression of God having its beautiful and needed niche. And Jesus saw that and knew that. So he came back to everyday people and showed them their value. And because he understood them, right? He understood who they were. And from that standpoint, love cannot just be this quid pro quo deal thing. You know, I'll love you as long as I'm getting the love back. Love can be just an expression of our natural being. And love is what's right, what makes us feel whole. And so we don't love to get something. We love because it's what we're designed to do. It's our kismet. It's our reason for living. Now, that little line, absolute faith and understanding of God, unselfed love, I think we can do that for others in this situation right now. So when we think about these politicians, when we think about our neighbors who might be really fearful, we can really have an absolute faith in them that all things are possible in their life, all good things, because God is good. We can really understand who they are fundamentally and that they're not a sinful mortal. God never created a sinful, diseased, fearful mortal. No, they're a beautiful, needed idea of God, timeless, just like my daughter is. And remember when I cradled her in my arms, we can cradle each and every individual we think about and behold them as a perfect, needed spiritual idea. And then we can love, because love is the heart and soul of Christian Science practice.